The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the kitchen as Ethan, 16, packed his camping backpack. His eyes gleamed with anticipation. Summer had arrived once again, and that meant only one thing: the traditional camping trip with his father, Michael. Since Ethan was young, Michael had taken him to explore the natural wonders of Canada. They started with short trips to provincial parks, progressing to more challenging trails each year. It was more than just a trip. It was a rite of passage, an opportunity to strengthen the bond between father and son, away from the distractions of the modern world. Ethan smiled, remembering all the adventures they had experienced together. Starry nights in Banff National Park, swimming in the crystal-clear lakes of Algonquin, and telling scary stories around the campfire in Jasper. Each trip brought new experiences, new challenges, and memories that would last a lifetime. This year, however, something seemed different. Michael was quieter than usual as he prepared the equipment. His hands, normally steady, trembled slightly as he checked the compass. Ethan noticed a wrinkle of concern on his father's forehead, something he had never seen before. "Everything okay, Dad?" Ethan asked, trying to disguise his own apprehension. Michael forced a smile. "Of course, son. Just thinking about the adventure ahead of us." The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the kitchen as Ethan, 16, packed his camping backpack. His eyes gleamed with anticipation. Summer had arrived once again, and that meant only one thing: traditional camping trip with his father, Michael. Since Ethan was young, Michael had taken him to explore the natural wonders of Canada. They started with short trips to provincial parks, progressing to more challenging trails each year. It was more than just a trip. It was a rite of passage, an opportunity to strengthen the bond between father and son, away from the distractions of the modern world. Ethan smiled, remembering all the adventures they had experienced together. Starry nights in Banff National Park, swimming in the crystal-clear lakes of Algonquin, and telling scary stories around the campfire in Jasper. Each trip brought new experiences, new challenges, and memories that would last a lifetime. This year, however, something seemed different. Michael was quieter than usual as he prepared the equipment. His hands, normally steady, trembled slightly as he checked the compass. Ethan noticed a wrinkle of concern on his father's forehead, something he had never seen before. "Everything okay, Dad?" Ethan asked, trying to disguise his own apprehension. Michael forced a smile. "Of course, son. Just thinking about the adventure ahead of us." After 2 hours of walking, terrain became even steeper. Ethan felt his muscles protest as he climbed an almost vertical slope, clinging to exposed roots to avoid slipping. "This is crazy," he exclaimed, sweat running down his face. Thought it would be a leisurely walk. Michael didn't respond immediately. His gaze wandered through the surrounding forest, an expression of unease on his face. Trees seemed different here, older and more twisted, their intertwined branches blocking much of the sunlight. "Something's not right," Michael muttered, more to himself than to Ethan. "It's as if the forest were watching them." An unnatural silence fell over them. There was no more birdsong, no buzz of insect, just the sound of their labored breathing and the occasional snap of twigs under their feet. Ethan felt a shiver run down his spine. The initial excitement of the adventure had been replaced by a growing sense of apprehension. As father and son exchanged worried looks, grim certainty settled in. This trail would lead them to places they never imagined exploring, testing not only their bodies, also their spirits. After hours of grueling hiking, Ethan and Michael finally reached a small clearing. The sun was already leaning westward, painting the sky with orange hues that barely penetrated the dense canopy of trees. "I think this is it, son," Michael said, letting his backpack fall heavily to the ground. Ethan looked around, his disappointment evident. "But where are the breathtaking views? Crystal clear stream? All I see are trees and more trees." clearing was nothing more than a small irregular space, surrounded by a green wall of vegetation. Ground was covered with dead leaves and twisted branches. There was nothing special there, no natural landmark, no scenic beauty, just the silent and oppressive forest. As they set up camp, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. His eyes constantly wandered along the tree line, searching for... what? Couldn't tell. "Dad, are you okay?" Ethan asked, noticing his father's restlessness. Michael forced a smile. "Of course, son, just tired from the hike." As night fell, the darkness seemed to swallow the clearing. The shadows of the trees lengthened, creating strange and threatening shapes. The fire they lit seemed small and inadequate against the vastness of the surrounding forest. Ethan moved closer to his father, seeking comfort. "Is it just me, or is it very quiet?" Michael nodded slowly. There were no sounds of nocturnal animals, not even the whisper of wind in the leaves. The silence was so deep, it made their ears ring. Sitting around the campfire, father and son exchanged worried glances. The excitement of the adventure had turned into a palpable sense of discomfort. Something in that forest wasn't right, and they could both feel it. As the flames danced, casting restless shadows on the surrounding trees, Ethan and Michael couldn't imagine that their true test was yet to come. The night would be long, and the secrets of the forest were about to reveal themselves in ways they could never have anticipated. Night advanced, swallowing the last vestiges of light. Ethan and Michael settled into their tents, the fatigue from the hike finally overcoming the uneasiness they felt. The silence of the forest was absolute, almost palpable. Not even the crackling of the campfire's embers dared to disturb that unnatural stillness. Ethan was almost falling asleep when it happened. A scream, sharp, desperate, laden with pain and anguish, it tore through the night like lightning. Ethan sat up abruptly, his heart hammering against his chest. "Dad?" called, his voice trembling. Michael was already coming out of his tent, eyes wide with fear and confusion. "Did you hear that?" Before Ethan could respond, the scream echoed again, closer this time. It was unmistakably a man's voice, a voice laden with visceral terror that made their blood run cold. "Help! Someone! Please!" The words were interspersed with sobs and groans of pain. Ethan grabbed his father's arm. "We have to help." Michael hesitated, his instincts conflicting. The desire to help fought against a primal fear that screamed for them to stay where they were. The screams continued, coming closer and moving away, as if the source was moving through the forest. At times, they seemed to come from all directions at once, further confusing their already impaired sense of orientation. "Stay here, Ethan," Michael finally said, grabbing the flashlight and pocket knife. "I'll see what's going on." "No, Dad. I'm coming with you," Ethan insisted, his voice firm despite the... Michael knew arguing was pointless. Ethan's presence by his side was a comfort he couldn't refuse at that moment. As they advanced into the darkness, guided only by the weak beam of the flashlight, the screams seemed to become more distant, until they finally ceased, leaving the forest once again plunged into an oppressive silence. Ethan and Michael stopped, panting and disoriented. Where did he go?" Ethan whispered, his voice shaking. "I don't know," Michael replied, his gaze lost in the surrounding darkness. "But we can't leave it like this. Let's keep looking." Little did they know that they were about to discover that the forest held secrets much darker and more terrifying than they could imagine. Secrets that weren't ready to be unveiled. As they advanced through the darkness, guided only by the weak light of the flashlight, Ethan and Michael couldn't shake off the feeling that they were being watched. Each step seemed to echo in the forest, the sound amplified by the absolute silence that surrounded them. "Dad, are you sure we're going in the right direction?" Ethan asked, his voice laden with apprehension. Michael didn't respond immediately. He felt the weight of responsibility, the fear of leading his son into unknown danger. "We can only keep trying, son," We need to find the source of those screams. After walking for about half an hour, they reached a small clearing. The scene that unfolded before them made their hearts stop for a moment. In the center of the clearing was a small improvised camp, similar to theirs. But what caught their attention was the figure prostrate on the ground, partially illuminated by the moon. A man in hiking clothes was lying face down, motionless. "My God," Michael muttered, running to the man. Ethan stayed behind, fear paralyzing his movements. Is he alive? Michael knelt beside the man, carefully turning him over. The face was contorted in an expression of pure terror, the wide eyes fixed on emptiness. His stomach was completely open, exposing his internal organs. "But what could have done this?" Michael said with a lump in his throat. Ethan felt a wave of nausea and panic. He vomited right there. Partially recovered, he said, "We should go back, Dad. We need to get out of here." Before Michael could respond, a strange sound interrupted them. A low murmur, almost imperceptible, but seeming to come from all directions. "You shouldn't be here." The voice was ethereal, like a whisper carried by the wind. Ethan and Michael jumped up, their eyes scanning the darkness around them. "Who's there?" Michael shouted, trying to stay calm. There was no answer, just that constant murmur, getting closer, more oppressive. "Let's get out of here," Michael said, grabbing Ethan by the arm. "Now." As they hurried away, the murmur followed them, like a malevolent whisper in the shadows. Forest, which before seemed only silent, now seemed alive, conscious, and clearly hostile. Father and son ran, driven by fear, not knowing that the forest still held its most terrible secret. That night would be a test of courage and sanity, a nightmare from which they could only escape together. The way back to the camp seemed much longer and more sinister than the initial journey. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every sound seemed an omen of something terrible. Ethan and Michael kept close, flashlight trembling in Michael's hand, projecting unstable beams of light that only increased the sense of dread. "We need to get out of here at dawn," Michael muttered, more to himself than to Ethan. "This forest, not normal." Ethan nodded, eyes wide and breathing fast. Whatever was happening there, they didn't want to find out. They needed to get back to civilization, tell someone about what they had seen. When they finally reached the camp, fire had gone out, leaving only a few glowing embers. The silence was back, but it was no longer a silence of peace. It was charged with tension and expectation. "Let's rest a bit, son," Michael said, trying to sound confident. "We'll stay together, and at the first sign of light, we leave." They settled in the tent, their backs pressed against the thin fabric, trying to find some comfort in each other's proximity. But sleep didn't come easily. The forest seemed to conspire against any attempt to rest, the murmurs now replaced by an almost deafening silence. At some point, Ethan dozed off, only to be abruptly awakened by a noise outside. A snap of a branch, followed by a subtle movement in the vegetation. "Dad," whispered, panic instantly returning. Michael was awake, eyes fixed on the tent entrance. "I heard it. Stay quiet." The noise continued, approaching. Then something scraped against the tent canvas, sound that made Ethan and Michael hold their breath. Whatever was out there was just inches away. Another sound came from behind the tent. Now they seemed like footsteps of some animal. They were heavy steps of something quite large. Ethan held his father's hand, who didn't even notice, and remained fixed on the tent entrance. The creature came closer, stopped and sniffed the fabric from outside. Two looked at each other as the creature's breath raised dust into the tent. The weak moonlight constructed the silhouette of the animal, something that was huge and bipedal. Michael saw a small crack in the fabric and went to look. Ethan held his hand, trying to pull him back, but to no avail. Michael looked and saw that black, hairy being with a body strong enough to tear apart anyone in front of it, but he couldn't identify what it was. It didn't look like any known animal. Its face was a mixture of wolf, with human feature. Suddenly, the creature looked directly at the crack where Michael was, who suddenly hid and remained motionless, hoping that it hadn't noticed his presence. In the following minutes, creature's footsteps slowly moved away, until the silence extended for what seemed like an eternity, and finally the sound of footsteps moving away broke the tension. Ethan let out the air, didn't even realize he was whole. "Let's get out of here," Michael finally said, decision clear in his voice. "We can't wait any longer." With quick and silent movements, father and son dismantled the camp, leaving behind anything wasn't essential. With the first light of dawn beginning to break the horizon, they started the trail back, fear driving every step. The way back was a blur of adrenaline and terror, forest seeming even more oppressive in the weak light of dawn. But eventually the familiar sounds of civilization began to penetrate the blanket of silence, and a sense of safety began to return. As they finally emerged from the forest, dirty, tired, and shaken, Ethan and Michael knew they would never forget that night. Whatever inhabited those trees would forever remain in their memories as a dark reminder of what it really means to venture into the unknown. However, their relief was short-lived. As they approached the trailhead, they heard a commotion. Park rangers and emergency vehicles were gathered, and a sense of dread washed over them. "What's happening?" Michael asked one of the rangers. The ranger looked at them with a mix of surprise and concern. "You two were out there? We've been searching for days. There have been reports of strange occurrences and missing hikers in this area." Ethan and Michael exchanged glances, the weight of their experience settling in. They began to recount their harrowing night to the authorities, but as they spoke, they noticed the skeptical looks on the rangers' faces. "Look," one of the senior rangers said, "we appreciate you coming forward, but we've heard all sorts of stories about this forest. What we need now is hard evidence." Michael felt a surge of frustration. "But we saw it. The creature, the body in the clearing." "I'm sorry, sir," the ranger interrupted, "but we've combed these woods. There's no sign of any bodies or strange creatures. Just the usual wildlife." As the conversation continued, Ethan noticed something strange. The tree line seemed to be shifting. The forest was encroaching inch by inch on the clearing where they stood. "Dad," he whispered, tugging at Michael's sleeve. But before he could say more, a loud crack echoed through the air. One of the massive trees at the edge of the forest began to topple, its ancient trunk groaning as it fell. Time seemed to slow down. Michael pushed Ethan out of the way, but he wasn't fast enough to save himself. The massive tree crashed down, pinning Michael beneath its enormous weight. Chaos erupted. Rangers scrambled to free Michael, but the weight of the ancient tree was too much. Ethan screamed for help, his voice cracking as he tried to lift the branches that were pinning his father down. "Dad, hold on, please," Ethan cried, his hands shaking as he struggled with the massive trunk. Michael gasped for breath, pain etched on his face. "Ethan, listen to me," he said, his voice weak. "You have to get out of here. Don't let the forest take you too." "No, I'm not leaving you," Ethan protested, tears streaming down his face. But Michael shook his head, his eyes filled with both pain and love. "You have to survive. Both of us. The forest. It won't stop. Go. Now." Ethan hesitated, torn between the need to stay with his father and the primal urge to escape the nightmare that surrounded them. But as he looked into his father's eyes, he knew what he had to do. With a heavy heart, Ethan rose to his feet, taking one last look at Michael. "I love you, Dad," he whispered, returning and running towards the trail. Forest seemed to close in behind him, the trees twisting and shifting as if trying to trap him. But Ethan didn't stop. He ran with everything he had, the memory of his father's final words driving him forward. As he burst out of the tree line and into the open, Ethan collapsed on the ground, gasping for air. The rangers were still in chaos, trying to process what had just happened. But Ethan knew that the forest had claimed what it wanted. And as he lay there, staring up at the sky, he realized that the forest had been testing them all along. It wasn't just a place, it was something ancient, something alive, and it had decided who would live and who would die. Ethan was the one who survived, but the cost was unimaginable. He knew that the memory of that cursed trail and the father he had lost to it would haunt him for the rest of his life. The forest was silent once more, its secrets buried deep within the twisted trees, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to venture too far into its depths.